The following is a presentation of the Steamboat Church of Christ in Steamboat Springs, Colorado.
Who was the architect of the crucifixion of Christ? I mean, yes, we all know the answer to that question theologically, because God is sovereign over his creation, and the life and ministry of Christ on earth was no haphazard undertaking. God had a plan, and everything went according to his plan. That isn't my question. My question is, on the ground, as the events of the Passion Week were unfolding, and the life paths of Jesus and the apostles, and Judas and Caiaphas and Annas and Herod and Pilate, among countless others, were converging in Jerusalem, who, among all these human players in this grand drama, is the puppet master? Who, among these citizens of the realm, is the power broker who is calling the shots and orchestrating the disparate elements at play in order to work things insofar as God will allow to his own advantage? Well, I think the answer to that question is Pontius Pilate. You see, historically, Pilate has been viewed by Christians as a victim of circumstance, an innocent Gentile who never had any stake in what was largely a Jewish affair, but who drew the short straw and ended up having to be the one to preside over the trial of Jesus, and who, upon seeing that a great injustice was being done, tried to set things right, but after a few half-hearted attempts to save the life of Christ, conceded haplessly to the will of the people and washed his hands of the situation, allowing the Lord to be taken away and crucified. Thus, it has been historically maintained that culpability for the death of Jesus lies almost solely at the feet of the chief priests, who were empowered to bring about his death by the incompetence of Pontius Pilate. And that portrayal of Pilate's role in the death of Jesus is accurate to the extent that it corresponds to the facts presented to us in the gospel accounts of the crucifixion of Christ. But it may not be the whole truth, in that it does not correspond to the facts presented to us in secular history. But when the historical records surrounding the crucifixion of Christ are taken into account, a very different picture emerges. Because in these accounts, Pilate does not come across as an incompetent victim of history, but as a highly competent maker of history. In the Roman Empire in the first century, there were 40-some-odd provinces outside of Rome proper, each of which was governed by a prefect appointed by the emperor. One of these provinces was Judea, which covered the lands we now know as Israel, Lebanon, the Golan Heights, Gaza, the West Bank, plus parts of Sinai, Jordan, and Syria. Now, the way that Rome governed these provinces was as occupied client states. That is to say that the provinces were allowed to retain their local customs and their local religions. But for local governance, they were provided with rulers who were ethnically, linguistically, and religiously similar to, and so plausibly sympathetic to, the local population, but who were in actual fact clients of Rome, loyal to the emperor. And under this system, the role of the local leaders was to act as intermediaries between the people of the province and the Roman prefect. So the local leaders were not rulers per se, but handlers. This created the appearance that Rome was sympathetic to local customs, laws, religions, practices, and sensibilities, while in actual fact, Rome viewed such things mainly as exploitable tools which could be used to keep the local population in check. This is not dissimilar to the way that parents govern their adolescent children. They discover what it is that's important to the child and then create mechanisms by which to control access to those things, making them contingent on compliance with household rules. And extending this analogy further, the way that regional prefects handled their provinces could be compared to aloof parents appointing the eldest child in a family to be the babysitter of the other kids. And you know how that works. Because if mom and dad leave the eldest in charge when they go out for the evening and come home to find that things got out of hand, it isn't just the siblings who get into trouble, but the big brother or big sister as well. And this created a kind of solidarity in the local provinces, because even though the local leaders were the stooges of the regional prefect, the people felt a degree of kinship with him. At the same time, however, the local leader was in a state of constant jeopardy, because to the citizens he often appeared to be a quizzler, a weasel, a flunky of the prefect, and this made him suspect to the people. But as far as Rome was concerned, he had better be all of those things if he wanted to keep his job. Because whenever a local leader was failing to produce results that were acceptable to Rome, the regional prefect had the authority to fire that ruler and put another in his place. For instance, high priests at this period in Jewish history were not being selected biblically, but politically. For the entirety of the earthly ministry of Jesus, Caiaphas was the local leader over central Judea. But Pilate's predecessor, Valerius Gratus, who governed Judea from 15 AD to 26 AD, had dismissed 3 high priests before appointing Caiaphas to the position in 18 AD. So, when Pilate became the prefect of Judea in 26 AD, Caiaphas had already been in office for 8 years, and quite apparently had a proven track record of being cooperative with Rome. Because Pilate would have vetted him thoroughly, and if he had found him wanting, he would have gotten rid of him and would have appointed someone else to the position. But he hadn't found him wanting. He had found him to be well suited for the job. For though he did not lack zeal for the nation of Israel and he did not lack personal ambition, he had proven himself to be a reliable client of Rome, obedient to the emperor and obedient to the prefect, first to Valerius Gratus and now to Pontius Pilate. Now, as for Pilate, prior to the trial of Jesus, he had been involved in 2 other incidents which involved the kind of confrontation with the people and the local leaders which ended in showdowns of a sort between Pilate and the crowds. The first incident took place almost as soon as Pilate had taken office in 26 AD. It was in that time frame that a number of Roman soldiers had brought golden effigies of Tiberius into Jerusalem and had set them up in several key locations. Then, shortly after arriving in Judea, Pilate ordered iconic standards bearing his own name and the name of Tiberius to be set up in Herod's palace in the Holy City. And the response to these 2 actions took Pilate by surprise. He expected that the people would grumble, but he did not expect that almost the entire population of Jerusalem would march to Caesarea and demand that these icons be removed. And when Pilate obstinately refused, the mob shouted, "Do not break the peace. Do not make Tiberius an excuse for insulting our nation." When Pilate refused, they fell prostrate around his palace and for 5 whole days and nights remained motionless in that position. On the ensuing day, Pilate took his seat on his tribunal in the great stadium, and summoning the multitude with the apparent intention of answering them, gave an arranged signal to his armed soldiers to surround the Jews. And the Jews found themselves trapped in a ring of troops 3 deep. After threatening to cut them down if they refused to accept that the images of Caesar be displayed, Pilate signaled to the soldiers to draw their swords. Thereupon the Jews, as if by concerted action, flung themselves in a body on the ground, extended their necks, and exclaimed that they were ready rather to die than to transgress the law. Overcome with astonishment at such intense religious zeal, Pilate relented. The troops withdrew and Pilate agreed to remove the offensive iconography. The second incident took place 2 or 3 years later. In this incident, Pilate had financed the building of an aqueduct, a public works project with funds from the temple treasury. According to all the records, this was done with the full consent of the chief priests and the leading men of Judea, who saw the need for increasing the public fresh water supply and saw it as good stewardship to take advantage of Roman engineering and building skill to accomplish this goal. However, there was widespread opposition to the project by those who felt that the Corbanus, the temple fund that had been tapped for this project, was to be used only to help the poor and not for the good of the general public. And tens of thousands of men assembled in a protest against Pilate, demanding that the project be stopped. This time, however, Pilate handled the crowds differently than he had in the first riot. This time, he had his men go undercover in costume, dressed as Jews, and armed with clubs. Then, at the giving of a prearranged signal, they pulled out their clubs and began beating the protesters viciously. However, the Jews were not unarmed, and they fought back. And though they lost the day and the crowd was dispersed, they inflicted a number of casualties on the Romans. And the reprisals from Pilate in response to this were quite harsh. Indeed, this is thought to be the incident that is mentioned in Luke 13:1, where Luke tells us, "About this time some people came and reported to Jesus about the Galileans whose blood Pilate had mixed with their sacrifices." And in the aftermath, a number of the key figures in that uprising were arrested and charged with sedition and murder, the chief among them being a man named Barabbas. And now, another year or two after that, Pilate is still licking his wounds from both of these incidents. Because after the riot of the iconic standards, he looked weak. And after the aqueduct riot, according to Josephus, he was chastised severely by Rome for being too harsh. So he had spent a good deal of time reflecting on these two incidents and laying plans for his response to the next one, whenever it might come. Because he was resolved that he was not going to be caught off guard and was determined to have the upper hand the next time anything like this happened. And he made plans for every contingency. Whatever came his way, he was resolved to work it out to his own advantage. And he got this opportunity when Jesus rode into Jerusalem on the colt of an ass to the shouts and adoration of the crowds. Pilate knew what was coming. He knew that the season was ripe for another uprising, and this time he was prepared. That's the history. That's the backdrop against which I want you to think about the trial of Christ as we examine our text this morning. Because when we consider the biblical record of the trial of Jesus in the light of this understanding of the social and political environment in which it took place, a very different portrait of Pilate from the one that we have traditionally come to accept begins to emerge. Today's reading is a conflation of Matthew 27, 1 through 26, Mark 15, 1 through 15, Luke 23, 1 through 25, and John 18, 28 through 19:16. And it reads as follows: Early in the morning the whole company of them, the chief priests together with the elders of the people, the scribes, and the whole Sanhedrin, assembled hastily, came to order, and took a formal vote, conspiring to have Jesus put to death. And here I just want to remind you of something that I mentioned in my lesson a couple of weeks ago. In addition to all the people named here, among the mob that came to arrest Jesus and who stuck around for his trial was a dispatchment from the temple guard of an unknown number and a band of Roman soldiers. And this is important for today's lesson because the Greek word that's translated band is the word spera, which means cohort. And though in modern parlance we use the word cohort to refer to any entourage of any size, that was not the meaning in the first century. No, a cohort was a specific number of soldiers. A legion was a dispatchment of 6,000. And the word spera, cohort, could be used to refer either to a tenth of a legion or a maniple, a 30th of a legion. So the number of Roman soldiers, the number of full-on tactical military troops that were dispatched for the arrest of Jesus was either 200 or 600, a full complement with their captain. And this information is vital to understanding what's going on here, because no local leader ever got the usage of 600 Roman troops just for the asking. And under no circumstances would any prefect ever put his troops under the command of a local leader. No, in John 18:12, John makes a point of telling us that this cohort of soldiers was being commanded by their captain. And I can assure you that this captain was not answering to Caiaphas, even provisionally. No, the soldiers who came to arrest Jesus would have done so only on the direct orders from Pilate and only under the command of their own captain. So the presence of this cohort of Roman soldiers stands as evidence that Pilate knew exactly what was going on in Jerusalem that night. He knew who Jesus was, and he knew of the potential threat he posed to the public peace. And he sent his captain, along with 600 troops, not as muscle to do the bidding of Caiaphas, but in order that he, Pilate, might keep control of the situation. And keep control he did from the beginning to the end. Returning to our text, they bound him and led him away from the house of Caiaphas to the praetorium. And here we have further evidence of Pilate's involvement in the arrest of Jesus. It's the crack of dawn. It's 6 o'clock in the morning. And when they arrived at the praetorium, they didn't wake Pilate up, and Pilate didn't act as though he wasn't expecting them. No, clearly Pilate knew that they were coming. When they delivered him over to Pontius Pilate, the prefect, they themselves did not enter the praetorium so that they would not be defiled but could eat the Passover. So Pilate went outside to them and said, "What accusation do you bring against this man?" And they began to accuse him, saying, "We found this man subverting our nation and inciting the people to tax rebellion against Caesar, saying that he himself is Christ, a king." And Pilate asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" And he answered him, "In a manner of speaking." And this is very important. The only charge against Jesus that Pilate is concerned with is that of sedition. He couldn't care less about the charge of blasphemy or anything else the chief priests have against him. He homes in immediately on the charge that Christ has declared himself king. And why is that? Well, because that's the only charge that's of any use to him. Because Pilate is intent on coming out of this ordeal as a winner. He doesn't just want to survive this day uninjured. He wants to walk away with a trophy. He wants to walk away with a genuine victory. And to this end, he is intent on convicting Jesus of sedition, and sedition only. Not because he has anything against Jesus. He couldn't care less about Christ. Pilate wants to confine the case against the Lord to sedition because in order for the chief priests to make those charges stick, they must not only concede to the charges, but they must testify publicly that the reason Jesus cannot be the king of the Jews is because the Jews have abandoned all messianic hope and they are seeking no other king than the one that they already have, the emperor Tiberius. So Pilate manipulates this situation to produce that result. And part of the strategy for doing this is to play dumb when it comes to all other charges. Back to our text. And the chief priests accused him of many things. But when he was accused by the chief priests and the elders, he gave no answer. Then Pilate asked him, "Don't you hear the testimony they're bringing against you?" But Jesus made no reply, not even to a single charge, to the great amazement of the governor. Then Pilate said to the chief priests and the crowds, "I find no guilt in this man." They answered him, "If this man were not doing evil, we would not have delivered him over to you." Pilate said to them, "Take him yourselves and judge him by your own law." The Jews said to him, "It is not lawful for us to put anyone to death." This was to fulfill the word that Jesus had spoken, to show by what kind of death he was going to die. And they persisted urgently, saying, "He stirs up the people, teaching throughout all Judea, from Galilee even to this place." When Pilate heard this, he asked whether the man was Galilean. And when he had confirmed that he belonged to Herod's jurisdiction, he sent him over to Herod, who was himself in Jerusalem at that time. When Herod saw Jesus, he was very glad, for he had long desired to see him, because he had heard about him, and was hoping to see some sign done by him. So he questioned him at some length, but Jesus made no answer. The chief priests and the scribes stood by, vehemently accusing him, and Herod with his soldiers treated him with contempt and mocked him. Then, dressing him in full regalia, they sent him back to Pilate. And this is yet another ploy on Pilate's part. Prior to this, there's no record indicating that Pilate ever referred any case, even the most minor of cases, to Herod. And there's a reason for that. Remember, this wasn't Herod the Great, who was a king in his own right. No, this was his grandson, Herod Antipas, who was a trifling, piffling, cavilling scapegrace, a fool among princes, who was respected neither by his peers nor by the people. He would never have been appointed as a local leader on his own merits. The only reason he held any office was because of his family name. And this is reflected in the fact that he was appointed governor of the Galilee, which was arguably the least important province in the whole Roman Empire, known for its internal strife and widespread lawlessness, but not considered worthy of the time and effort it would have taken to clean it up. And it's hard to imagine why Pilate would go out of his way to extend anything like professional courtesy to Herod. So why did Pilate send Jesus to Herod? Well, we don't know exactly why, because he never says, and neither does Herod. But whatever the reason, the evidence suggests that the act itself was part of an agreed-upon plan between the two of them. Because according to Acts 4:27, Herod and Pontius Pilate met together with the Gentiles and the people of Israel in Jerusalem to conspire against Jesus, whom God had anointed. And whatever it was exactly that they conspired to do, it would appear that the outcome was mutually beneficial to the both of them. As Luke tells us in Luke 23:12, "And Herod and Pilate became friends with one another that very day, for before this they had been at odds with one another." And when Jesus returns to the praetorium, Pilate begins working the crowd with renewed vigor and confidence. Pilate called together the chief priests, the rulers, and the people and said to them, "You brought me this man under the pretext that he was inciting the people to rebellion. But I have examined him in your presence and have found no basis for your charges against him. Neither has Herod, for he sent him back to us. As you can see, he has done nothing to deserve death. Therefore I will chasten him and then release him." And from all appearances, this whole interaction is a ruse on Pilate's part. a charade intended to steer the chief priests and the crowd in the direction he wants them to go. Because when he goes back into the praetorium, he simply resumes his conversation with Jesus. There's nothing happening in there that has any bearing on the outcome of this case. No, what Pilate is doing in the praetorium with Jesus is the same thing that a car salesman does when he goes back to the back office to run your bid by the manager. It's just chatting for a few minutes while you stew over the deal in the outer office. So Pilate entered the praetorium again and summoned Jesus and said to him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Jesus answered, "Do you say this of your own accord, or did others say it to you about me?" Pilate answered, "Am I a Jew? Your own nation and the chief priests have delivered you over to me. What have you done?" Jesus answered, "My kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, my servants would have been fighting that I might not be delivered over to the Jews. But my kingdom is not from hence." Then Pilate said to him, "So you are a king?" Jesus answered, "In a manner of speaking, I am a king. For this purpose I was born, and for this purpose I have come into the world, to bear witness to the truth. Everyone who is of the truth listens to my voice." And Pilate said to him, "What is truth?" And here I just want to mention that the question, what is truth, is a question that deserves its own lesson, which lesson I plan to deliver next week. Back to our text. Now at the feast, the governor was accustomed to releasing for the crowd any one prisoner, whomever they asked for. And among the rebels in prison, there was a notorious criminal named Barabbas, who had been thrown into prison after inciting an uprising among the people and committing murder in the ensuing insurrection. And the crowd arose and began to ask Pilate to do as he usually did for them. After speaking to Jesus, Pilate went back outside to the Jews and told them, "I find no guilt in him. But you have a custom that I should release one man for you at the Passover. So do you want me to release to you the king of the Jews?" And this too seems to be part of a predetermined plan worked out by Pilate and the chief priests beforehand. Because according to the text, the chief priests knew that the question was coming. And in preparation for the question, they had coached the crowd to give a predetermined response to Pilate. But they all cried out together, "Away with this man, and release to us Barabbas." For the chief priests and the elders had persuaded the crowd to ask for Barabbas to be released and for Jesus to be put to death. And Pilate knew that it was out of envy that they had delivered him up. Now, while he was sitting on the judgment seat, his wife sent him a communique which ran, "Have nothing to do with that righteous man, for I have suffered much because of him today in a dream." Now, the purpose of telling us this is unclear, but this apparently happened, and it's part of the narrative. Now, as the people were rallying, Pilate said to them, "Whom do you want me to release to you, Barabbas or Jesus, who's called the Christ? Which of the two do you want me to release?" And they said, "Barabbas." Pilate said to them, "Then what shall I do with Jesus, who is called the Christ?" They said, "Let him be crucified." "What shall I do with the man you call the King of the Jews?" And they cried out again, "Crucify him." And Pilate said to them, "Why? What evil has he done?" But they shouted all the more, "Crucify him." Pilate addressed them once more, urging the release of Jesus. But they kept shouting, "Crucify, crucify him." A third time he said to them, "Why? What evil has he done? I have found in him no guilt deserving death, therefore I will chasten him and release him." And here, Pilate's manipulation of the crowd seems evident. He wants the crowds to concede that of all the things with which Jesus is charged, the crime that really matters is that of sedition, that of claiming to be a king. And he's not going to give them what they want until he hears those words come out of their mouths. The arrest of Barabbas had come on the heels of a bloody conflict, and the crowd had been dispersed by the time he was in custody. But now Pilate had the opportunity to convict a Jewish rebel of high treason and to compel the Jewish people to concede that treason against Rome was not just illicit, but that it was immoral, and that those who committed this crime deserved to die. Then Pilate took Jesus and had him flogged, and the soldiers twisted together a crown of thorns and put it on his head and arrayed him in a purple robe. They came up to him saying, "Hail, King of the Jews," and struck him with their hands. Pilate went out again and said to them, "Behold, I am bringing him out to you, that you may know that I find no guilt in him." So Jesus came out wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe. Pilate said to them, "Behold, the man." When the chief priests and the officers saw him, they cried out, "Crucify him! Crucify him!" Pilate said to them, "Take him yourselves and crucify him, for I find no guilt in him." The Jews answered him, "We have a law, and according to that law he ought to die because he has made himself the Son of God." Hearing this claim startled Pilate more than anything else had. He entered his headquarters again and said to Jesus, "Where are you from?" But Jesus gave him no answer. So Pilate said to him, "You will not speak to me? Do you not know that I have authority to release you and authority to crucify you?" Jesus answered him, "You would have no authority over me at all unless it had been given to you from above. Therefore he who delivered me over to you has the greater sin." Now it's difficult to know what, if any, impact these words had on Pilate. But it's worth noting that Pilate immediately returns to goading the crowd without skipping a beat. Thereupon Pilate sought once again to release him. But the Jews cried out, "If you release this man, you are no friend of Caesar's. Everyone who makes himself a king opposes Caesar." When Pilate heard these words, he brought Jesus out and sat down on the judgment seat at a place called the Stone Pavement, in Aramaic, Gabbatha. Now, it was the day of preparation of the Passover. It was about the 6th hour. He said to the Jews, "Behold, your king." They cried out, "Away with him! Away with him! Crucify him!" Pilate said to them, "Shall I crucify your king?" The chief priests answered, "We have no king but Caesar." Only then did Pilate deliver Jesus over to them to be crucified. And here Pilate receives his long-awaited prize. He had dropped all the charges against Jesus except for the charge of sedition. And he kept telling the crowds that he was going to let him go. And when they protested, he would follow up with the question, "Why should I convict this man?" And he wasn't going to give them a conviction until they themselves stated for the record that the Lord's only crime was high treason, and that that crime was the crime for which Jesus ought to be put to death. They themselves had to state that those who were charged with sedition against Rome were not political prisoners. They were criminals who deserved to die for their crimes. And he got that when he compelled the chief priests to go on record saying, "We have no king but Caesar." And according to John 19:16, only then did he deliver Jesus over to them to be crucified. When Pilate perceived that there was nothing more to be gained, he was willing to assuage the crowd, who were on the brink of riot. He took water and washed his hands before the crowd, saying, "I am innocent of this man's blood. See to it yourselves." And all the people answered, "May his blood be on us and on our children." Then he released for them Barabbas, the man who had been thrown into prison for insurrection and murder, and having flogged Jesus, delivered him over to be crucified. Beloved, every portrait of Pilate I have ever heard depicts him as a victim of circumstance, an incompetent prefect who didn't want to crucify Jesus, but was outmaneuvered by the chief priests and backed into a corner. And if you look at the Bible alone, without the benefit of secular history, that really seems to be the case. But when you look at all the information available to us, a very different picture emerges. A picture of a highly skilled politician who exploited the opportunity presented to him by the trial of Jesus to outmaneuver the chief priests and back them into a corner. Because after this day, Caiaphas and his contemporaries could never again make the claim that any rebellion against the Roman Empire was righteous. They would have no choice but to stand with Rome in condemning all Jewish zealots to death for the crime of high treason. Beloved, Pilate was not the victim of circumstance. He was the architect of the crucifixion of Christ, which event he managed from beginning to end to his own advantage. And for the most part, he seems to have gotten away with it, for he did so without incurring the wrath of the Jews, the wrath of Christianity, or the wrath of history. And it's with that in view that we will return next week to John 18:38, where Pilate himself asks one of the most poignant questions presented to us in the Bible. What is truth? And that's my lesson for today.
This has been a presentation of the Steamboat Church of Christ. May the grace and peace of our Lord Jesus Christ be with you.